Okay, so welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, Florencia. Thank you, Marceline, for having me. Hi, everyone. My name is Majid Al-Hinai. I graduated from SCI-Arc from the MArc 2 program in 2016, and then I did the Design Theory and Pedagogy program in 2017. And from then on, I started teaching at Kent State. I was a fellow there. I still teach with them kind of through the internet now. But since then, I've been trying to kind of find my own way in the world of practice, doing some design consultancy and, doing real world stuff, That's it.
And Jai, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, Florencia, Marceline. It's really great to see you guys. Thank you for having me. I graduated from MArc 2 in 2010. Actually, Florencia was my grad thesis advisor that year. I went on to start with my sister Jai and Jai Gallery, which we ran consistently for 5 years. It's still around, we're here, but I actually took a hiatus and moved back to Bangkok, Thailand to work in real estate development, mainly hospitality, commercial and retail as well. So I just returned from Bangkok the end of last October in 2019. We've maintained a space here in Frogtown. We used to be, Jai and Jai Gallery used to be located in Chinatown, but we're in Frogtown currently, this space. It's sort of like a warehouse right now. And since I wanted to get conversations going again, but COVID happened, so we sort of like let that settle in first. And I've since, I'm doing design and fabrication with a team next door. We're working on 2 projects. We just finished a recording studio in Crenshaw. Architectural millwork is our focus. And the current project that we're working on and finishing up is a boutique hotel along the Venice Boardwalk. And then currently bidding for another project, large light boxes out of aluminum. So yeah, just trying to keep busy and stay connected and see what's going on. But it's good to be back in Los Angeles, that's for sure.
Fantastic. And Benjamin, would you like to tell us about yourself?
Yeah, I'm Benjamin Ball. Thanks for having me. Nice to see everybody. I began in SCI-Arc in 1989, and I was there until 94, but then I didn't get my bachelor's until 2003. That's a long story, but that's kind of my educational experience with SCI-Arc. In the interim time, I was working as a set designer for movies, commercials, music videos. Then I worked for a few more architects, and ultimately I started a studio called Ball Noguez Studio with Gaston Noguez in 2004. And since that time, we have been hard at work designing and fabricating array of public art projects and projects that sort of fall in a place somewhere between architecture and installation art. I've been teaching, I taught the last 2 terms at SCI-Arc, doing a design build seminar where we proposed a bridge for the Huntington Gardens with MAD Workshop, which is David Martin's of AC Martin's foundation. I've also taught at UCLA and USC, and just happy to be here.
Thank you. Fantastic. And I think Vincent.
So Marceline, Vincent is texting me that he has problem with internet, so he will join shortly. So.
Okay. And he is, Vincent is a sculptor and has a studio that he designs many amazing objects. Some are kind of furniture related. There's a whole feature on him in the SCI-Arc channel for anyone who wants to see a little bit more behind the scenes. So I think with that,
he graduated what in 2010, 2012.
I think so.
I don't. Well, he'll let us know. I don't remember. Yeah. Not that long ago, but yeah. Thank you, guys.
Thank you. So we will begin with Reza Salehi, and I will keep time so we have exactly 20 minutes. Please keep all the students, keep your presentation to 3 minutes so that we have enough time for discussion. And when the time is up, I'll hold the phone up I'll send a text to you saying time up. So, okay, thank you. Reza, would you like to share your screen?
Okay, yes. Hello, my name is Reza, and this is my project. I start with here. Every year, around 22 million Shia, mostly from Iraq and Iran, participate in the Arbaeen pilgrimage and walk from Najaf to Karbala in Iraq in the specific time that's named Arbaeen. My thesis attempt to enrich the pilgrimage route by transferring the message of Imam Hussein through experiences that are distributed throughout the pilgrimage route in the architectural plan. The relationship between individual and the aggregation of people in pilgrimage that is like the role of bits in a digital system and would apply as a principle in this project. According to discrete logic, forms are amassed through a technique of combining smaller components that have independent identity. There are 3 precedents in this project. First, calligraphy. Calligraphy as an architectural material, like its historical role in Islamic architecture, as you can see here, calligraphy had a tectonic role in some specific period of Islamic architecture. Aggregation of building in Isfahan Bazaar is taken as the second precedent, that its components maintain their own identity, and at the same time they produce a larger semi-coherent form. And Caravanserai is my third precedent. Caravanserai's program is a place to where travelers gather for a short time during a journey. Caravanserai provides a platform for for interactions between different people with different cultural contexts, and pilgrims can share their experiences there. At the first step, I try to make a new language by curving the calligraphic forms. In the next step, I made these forms by applying the calligraphic profile and extruding them and applying different software tools like Boolean difference, Boolean intersects to make these forms. Next step is gathering the forms to make these complex that I try to represent Caravanserai qualities. And here you can see the spaces that are available in every form. And you can see the map, start point in Najaf and end point in Karbala. Number 1 and number 2 are points that complex will place. Point A, B, C are more smaller forms that gives some services to pilgrims, and rectangular forms are some bridges that I will make to give every pilgrim a different point of view to have different experiences from being in the crowd. Every pilgrim can see the crowd from the above. This is one of the places that now there is in the beside the route, and I will try to make spaces with better qualities, architectural qualities. These are photos of my models and just for rendering from them. Yeah.
Thank you, Reza.
You're welcome.
So maybe it's helpful if you zoom in on one of the models that you think represents the project best. Or the rendering, or whichever view is showing the project the best.
Is this good?
So Reza, I'll just start. So this image that you're showing right here, this is your miniature model.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so my next question for you would be, how dependent is your project on form? Is it really the main driver, or is it the political aspect that's the main driver? And if so, how are you starting to use form to kind of bridge this gap between your story and also, you know, the relationship to calligraphy and the roots of?
Mm-hmm. Actually, for making these forms, I try to use some specific phrases that pilgrims are using in this pilgrimage. I think you are familiar with these because of your language. Uh, I try to use some phrases that have a specific meaning for pilgrims, and I try to make my forms with these phrases. So after that, I try to discover some architectural quality in these forms, like distance between every alphabet, and having some like mass and void between them to create my form, and gathering the forms together, if I understand your question right and try to explain it.
Yeah, you know, what's interesting about the miniatures project as a whole is scale is a really important factor here, especially at the size that you're producing these really large, you know, texts at. So that's why I asked, like, how important is form to you? Because, you know, as a user in the space, so far I haven't really seen, you know, proportion to the body, how big really this is. So at what point is the text really important versus creating, you know, positive and negative space, as opposed to the scale that it originally is at in, you know, the calligraphy, slightly shallow relief, slightly raised figures on a surface. So it's interesting here how you've blown up the scale so large, to the point that each of your words is creating a new space or a new room, as opposed to what it means to the person coming up to it, if they could actually tell. Because you said the phrases are symbolic to you. I mean, I read, you know, peace in Arabic. So you know, it's good to keep these things in mind. Will you go into a smaller scale in producing these words or these phrases back onto the surface? Or does it stay at this large scale that you have it currently?
Actually, there's 2 points here. I think I have 2 choices here. One of them is just using these phrases to make the larger forms, and another one is in the next step that I want to develop the forms, I can use these phrases in decorative motif, but in tectonic way, to mm, to apply it on every pieces. So in every pieces, I can use calligraphic forms in new way again and applying them for in decorative forms. Something like this you can see here in this is the historical version, but I should try to make a new version of it.
To also add to the questions that Melissa just asked, concerning scale, is this more, do you see it more on an urban scale level or formally a building? Or I'm just curious where you start to see the calligraphy and these forms coming together as you start to configure them. Is it, just wondering if that's something that was also in your vision for the end product, for the end project?
For the end, these forms would be cover these, not cover, we made this route with aspect something like Isfahan Bazaar, putting these forms beside together to make a route from this point to this point, and in some spaces with aggregation of building, I have some bigger forms, and in some parts with just smaller form, I will just form the route.
I also like the part that you brought. I'm sorry, just to, it just brings up the negative and positive, and also if the formal language is really not to just literally formally, that looking into the negative spaces as well that you're starting to do looks to me really interesting to see what that spatially does for the route as well, and what sort of other forms come out of the actual positive.
Actually, these negative and positive forms will help me to have pilgrims in there. In positive forms, I can give some services to pilgrims, and in negative points would be the spaces that pilgrims can walking through it and have something like an architectural experience during the route.
Do you see the formal vocabulary, the formal moves that you're making developing over the term? I mean, I guess I'm interested in the source material that you're using, because as an observer of this, calligraphy and calligraphic arts, in my mind, relates to writing, and writing, especially writing by hand. And you seem to be working with a set of glyphs, you know, letters and glyphs that are standardized, that have no individual character. In other words, if you were to use them use a particular one in one location, it would have the same basic geometric characteristics as one in another location. And I guess there's a kind of machinic quality to them. It's almost like, to me, what we're seeing is the difference between print and digital type. And my sense is that you really don't do yourself a favor by using a kind of digital or regularized kind of glyph versus a hyper individualized type of glyph, like the kind that one would make if they were to draw or produce those glyphs by hand. So with all that said, I'm wondering, have you given any thought to drawing, to using glyphs that were produced by hand?
Actually, I use these forms just because of its history, that this form of calligraphy in the past was using just in architectural decorative motifs. It's not a kind of calligraphy that uh, in the past used for writing by hand. It's a kind of calligraphy that's only used in buildings and architectural forms.
Mm-hmm.
Because of that, I use these forms.
I think another thing I'm interested in is the way that you have begun these studies there to the right of your miniatures, and I think that those, I see a lot of the ones with the gray backgrounds and without any color in them. Yeah, that series right there. Those to me are starting to be suggestive of a calligraphic kind of artwork or a calligraphic tablet or text. It feels like that to me. It would serve your argument well if you were to really study how these glyphs appear on the page and how they are isolated on the page and or isolated on the architectural surface that you're referencing here. Like they look almost like writing, and I think that that's writing on a page. And I think that that's good. I think that that's strong. I just still, I mean, is that calligraphy? I mean, I don't know. Going back to what I was saying, is it actually calligraphy if it's not written by hand?
I can't say no, because if someone that be familiar with alphabet look at this, he cannot read it, because there are a lot of change on that. Just calligraphy here is just a start point, and
Okay.
just using, just I try to use its qualities.
Yeah, well, I think that's where you're getting, that's where I'm having trouble, is that I think that you're excluding, at least in my popular understanding of calligraphy, a lot of what I associate with calligraphy. And I'm just like Googling calligraphy as we speak, and it's the idea of calligraphy is generally tied to the idea of the hand and of this art of writing. And I wonder if you should, use that term if you're going to go in this direction. Maybe find a different term that's more appropriate to this kind of more regularized glyph system that you're using, or if you should dispense with the term calligraphy entirely.
I think, Benjamin, that point raises the possibility that maybe when you go to the next step of starting to work with the texture on the building, maybe that might be a moment where exploring some of those qualities that would come with the kind of handwritten or painted stroke, maybe that could actually start to interfere with the more machinic quality of these. Because one thing I think that that you've been working with is this idea of discrete logics in architecture, and almost how the discrete chunk does become like a digital bit in a system. I think you started off by talking about it. So I think Benjamin's suggestion might be a perfect way to start to kind of create an interference between the regularity and then other strokes that sort of move across that have a different character. But we're now running out of time. So are there any final comments for Reza before we move on?
I think it's a good start.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh,
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Reza.
you're welcome. Thank you.
And now we will see Sixtina's project. Hi, Sixtina.
Hi, I'll just get right into it. I'm just working in between two screens, so if I'm looking over there, I'm just setting up the presentation.
Is that Vincent? Did I just see you?
Yeah, hi.
Hi. We introduced you at the beginning, and I was telling everyone there's a great SCI-Arc channel feature that they can watch to find out more about your practice. And we're just about to start the second project with Sixtina.
Oh, great.
Okay,
Sorry,
so, so this is a detail of my miniature model, but I will get back to it later. I'm working on a memory that is no longer mine. By transforming an architectural body, not only does the initial memory transform, but a new architectural setting arises. The transformation goes through three main stages: documentation, transformation, and interpretation. The first stage entails the documentation of the architectural memory through the production of images. The second is where these documentations are manipulated by AI software that acts as an agent of transformation through convoluting formal and material qualities. These transformed images are processed by images of themselves. With these images, I then created a storyboard for my animation, but as a storyboard is not I don't want to have the main focus on it. It's just important to understand that it's made up of three scenarios, which is the forest, the exterior, and the interior. And as the project evolved, they will merge into each other. The final stage of interpretation is where I apply architectural reflection and new architectural settings emerge. And calling these new spaces the fabrics of interwoven memories. At this point, they're not inhabited by the human, so the main character and narrator of the space is the camera. So this is my first bathroom scene. Tectonic, tactile, and textual qualities seemingly wave and layer over each other. Memories are often staged through sets of data which may be incomplete. Whereas human memory is spatial, physical, and temporal, the AI's apparatus is fueled with flat data. The dynamics that occur between the engagement of human memory and machine memory express themselves through various layers of resolution. These are studies of my first scene and my miniature model, where the low resolution model of the trees grow out of the parquet that emphasize their modularity, and the higher resolution texture is the manipulated chapel. So here are the models that I'm currently printing in green so that I can experiment with applying the texture afterwards digitally. So then I get back to my miniature model. And for the end, I would like to leave you with a question that I'm asking myself as I'm going through the project. So as cyborgs, AI has become a sort of prosthetic to our creativity. And in this project, the illustrative and sensational characteristics of human memory merge with the algorithmic processes which create patterns of data. As the memory has now re-identified itself, whom does it belong to?
What's the last thing you said? The last phrase?
Yeah, as the memory has re-identified itself, whom does it belong to?
So I have a question, 16. What is the relationship between the texture map and the physical object? What relationship are you trying to gain from applying or projecting that texture onto it?
And so I want to make an animation that all like comes together then, and I'm experimenting on like how these architectural interpretations of the AI can evolve to physical space. So either I'm experimenting with the model and I'm experimenting with the digital spaces.
Is your MO to use mapping as a means of doing this, you said? You're going to map onto forms?
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, yeah. I mean, I think that, and your ultimate result will be an animation or you're thinking, or a physical model?
Yeah, it would be an animation, and I'm thinking of like if I have then this forest, that I would either I film it and then I key out the green and apply the texture on it, or I make an AR app and I film the AR app as it's going over the forest, but then applies the texture.
I mean, why a forest? Maybe I missed that.
It's because, well, I'm transforming an architectural memory.
Mm-hmm.
And so the forest is part of the memory, as it's part of the architectural body that I chose. And but you can see the memory more as basically a found object, and that's what I chose to use.
Why not modify the form? Why stop at mapping?
Well, I'm modifying the form in this scene here.
Yeah.
So I want to have it on different mediums. So one would be where it's completely modifying the form. Mm-hmm. And then the other one would be in applying it to the form.
I mean, that seems like a lot of territory to cover, and it would be useful to really hone I mean, you can experiment with it now, but ultimately it seems like you might want to focus on, you know, really refining a technique, because you're into sort of territory that's not, the criteria for judging it are sort of, it's hard to judge. So I think the more rigorous your logic is and rigorous your methods and is in producing your artifacts, we can then, you know, critique the method that you've used to do it. But and I think that you could, you know, find innovation in, you know, if you really probe a particular, you know, set of techniques. But if you're kind of trying a little of this and trying a little of that, pretty soon I think you're going to, your project could seem very nebulous and undefined, and that can be a little bit of a problem with a thesis.
I think your project is very experiential, so I'm interested in the form of representation that you'll be using. You said animation, but is there potential to produce a website out of this? I think the way that you were kind of showing us the presentation, I imagine, I don't know if you're using a website or what you're showing us this presentation on. I can't even tell what the software is, but if you were to produce a website, I think that would be an interesting form of, you know, presenting these memories, or taking us through a flow or an experience where the user is, you know, whoever's moving through this website, and they can go through each of the memories on their own terms rather than watching a full-length film that takes you from, you know, beginning to end.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's what you were thinking.
Yeah, as I was preparing this presentation, I definitely also thought about it.
That 16, is that question that you left with us, is that something that you'd like to answer by the end of the thesis about the memory of and who it then belongs to? Is that sort of the umbrella question that you'd like to bring throughout your process?
Yeah, because I'm kind of thinking about the collaborative authorship in a way, and that's how when we use AI, and that's why I'm kind of working with memory, because the AI is also based on a data set that can be kind of seen as a sort of memory, and that creates these patterns, where, versus for the human, where it creates this illustrative sensational experiences, and how these can then work together. And so this question, like if I transform this memory and this new space comes out of it, it's, I'm kind of I want to ask myself the question, like, whom does it belong to then?
Well, I think I think if you want to ask those questions, you'd be better served. You might be well served by developing a software system that you can plug these images or models, what you might call your own memories or your own source material, your own inputs, and plug them into this system, and out comes some unimaginable result. That would talk about memory as a process, and memory as a not belonging to a person, a particular individual. It's hard to, you know, if you're trying to distance yourself from the notion of authorship, then it seems to me that you have to have something that writes memories and writes images and creates images on the fly.
Yeah, well, what I was thinking about more is that it's already actually happening. Like, we're using so much AI, so our experiences are already going on different softwares. So that's why I chose for this project not to do a software, but to actually go back to the images that these images that I transformed from the memory, and really try to make architectural analysis of them, so that it becomes like this merged process of me and the AI working together. And I think in the next step, maybe after the thesis, then I would think about a software or something as a result of this thesis.
Yeah, I think you have to look very carefully at the notion of authorship, and there's a lot of ways that artists and designers have called into question authorship, and you know, this is a work in progress, obviously, but I think you should look very carefully about what you consider to be the product of this project, and you know, if I guess I'm making a case for not producing like a product, but instead inventing a process and putting that process into motion when at someone's you know, when someone wants it.
Yeah, I think
Sorry. Go ahead, Ben. Sorry.
I think if you had a process that you were inventing, would also go well with the forest. Just in the notion that in a forest you have a lot of like trees that are similar, you know, that pop up, but then they have varying degrees of heights or width or whatnot. So if you had that process, you could also argue the case for the forest, because then you could just create a field of objects that were hopefully being created out of the different variables within your own process.
I mean, yeah, forest is, you maybe like, are you saying, Vince, that like, hi, you're saying that a forest is a kind of a good point of reference, because we all have a pretty, it's pretty easy for anyone to generate from memory an image of a forest.
Right, yeah, that, and also just in terms of when I think about generating something from a process, I think about generating a lot of the same thing that might have slightly differing variables, you know,
Right.
So you have a lot of objects that look the same, a lot
Right.
of trees or whatever that, you know, are acting in this environment together in you know, accordingly with whatever the process is you're inventing.
You have a standard by which you can compare your results.
Right.
Did you have something you were about to say, Jai?
Oh yeah, I just out of pure curiosity, the what's on the screen with these images, you know, are these, I might have missed it when you were describing it. Are these images particularly chosen to map onto the forest as a, and are these particular, or, and will those images change? I was just curious where these came from, just as a reminder.
Yeah, so these are the images that I manipulated with the AI. And
Okay.
I manipulated them always with another image of itself. So this was the bathroom, and I took the tiles and the faucets to merge it with the image of the bathroom. And then I like analyzed this image to create this scene here.
How important are the images, and how particular are they? Because going off of like comments from Ben and Vince about creating this process, and almost like a process that is open to interpretation and authorship, like you're inventing something that is open-ended at the end, and there is, maybe it's sort of a rhetorical question. That's, so how important are those images through this process for you? It's more of a,
You mean the original images that I took, or the ones that are manipulated?
how embedded is it if you were to go in this direction and creating a, I know it was just said, but how important would those images during the course of this process during thesis is that to the overall idea of inventing this process and it being mapped onto a found object of sorts?
Okay, so I don't think that there's like a fixed number of images or something, but what I noticed is that at the beginning I had a lot, and then I was thinking, that's why I wasn't showing my storyboard, but in the storyboard I had it more as that you would go into these different rooms. But then I felt like as I was working, that it seems more, if I would work with the AI together, that they're actually no rooms anymore, but that it becomes one space. And then as the camera would go through the spaces, if there's a scene change, that becomes a sort of threshold. but it kind of breaks up the idea of like going from one room to the next. And initially I had like one image for a room, and so I'm kind of breaking up those.
I think something that's fascinating, Sixtina, is that the act of taking the photograph is a way that conventionally we retain a memory. Like we travel somewhere and we take the photograph so we can look at it later and remember that we were there and what we did there and what it smelled like and what, you know, what was happening, what we were hearing. And so your selection of these scenes, I think that that act of photographing and saying, okay, this is engaging sort of human memory, and then allowing the AI to begin to process those through an act of like machine learning and just having to, for the AI, having to engage a memory process. And then you yield this new house in a sense. I mean, in a way, we assume the stability of architecture, the kind of inert quality of like, there's this stable identity to this house, and then maybe the unstable quality of our memories. And now that yields yet another house, a very different one that you've never inhabited, that we've never inhabited. And so then the question that becomes maybe the scene for other forms of memory to be mapped on. So it seems to me this is like kind of commenting on that, that is so important, that role of the photograph.
Mm-hmm.
And I just wanted to see if, because we're out of time, but if any closing comments?
Sixtina, I missed your presentation because I was traveling through the other group, but this image is amazing. That's all I can say. I mean, I'm not, I mean, I mean, again, I missed the narrative. Maybe you'll send me later, but I think this, from the ones and the model actually photo, you know, was quite beautiful. The one, the tower. Sorry that we broke the tower, by the way.
Can you show that real quickly again, Sixtina, the miniatures photo that you had?
Yes. Oh, I see the process
Yes.
now. Okay. So, Sixtina, this is not a comment. It's not fair. I haven't seen the presentation, but I think that if you, I mean, the 3D printed model, of course, separated itself from that background. But I saw those process images were synced, and I know you wanted to 3D print in paper, no?
Yes.
Maybe you should now that we have time, why don't you resend the file? Sorry for the technical, but maybe, I think maybe you were right. Printing in paper, it would make sense because it will blur that tree with the background more.
Yeah, that was the idea.
Yes, but it was not enough time, I think, to get it for miniatures for the photographer.
But maybe can be used as a green screen too, to project as a green screen.
Yeah, that
Right,
was the idea. When it didn't work with the paper, then I decided to make it in green so that I can use it as a sort of green screen.
Yes, yes, exactly. Use a green screen. Maybe you need the right green screen, but I think I will go ahead with the paper again. I will resend the file because looking at this photo, I think it would be really nice to see that blending of the two, like I see in the process images.
Yeah. Okay, I'll do that.
Right. That's it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Right, so now we will move on to Wesley.
Hi, everyone. Just give me 1 second. Does everyone see a web browser with a red image?
Yes.
Great. All right. So minimize this. Okay. So this thesis contends that soon we will have to live in ways that make us categorically unexploitable, the body at rest as opposed to the body at work, and that perhaps the most total liberation of the body might only be realized within spaces which are completely unreliant on its continuous labor. That is to say, not spaces which are functionally concerned with leisure, but instead those which are automatic and thus do not require labor in exchange for function. It asks if perhaps there is no socioeconomic model, no matter how equitable, that could ever manifest the most radical forms of freedom for so long as its continued existence still fundamentally relied on the labor of living beings. And finally, it proposes that these new conditions of counterproductivity will comprise a reality which is relentlessly banal and heterotopic all at once. The project is rooted in the assertion that accessible and non-hierarchical spaces are not equivalent to or accounted for by the already codified architectural concept of universal space. Instead of universal space, the project offers a kind of unconditional space. In this sort of space, functions lose coherence, while the mutability of figure-ground and figure-figure relationships is emphasized, resulting in a liveliness based in deliberate ambiguities and instabilities. This is an architecture of the interior, an architecture of movement, context, and weak signals. These images foreground bodies, their actions and interactions, without making the conditions of those bodies primary. They can be turned, folded, and recontextualized. This parallels the assertion that the kind of spaces which are being developed in this project are ones which can accommodate the human body while simultaneously rejecting the humanist body, or whatever spatial regimes are predicated on an assumption of primacy of that form and experience. So what you are seeing here are some really early images of this project. And so far the work has developed on two separate fronts. And I'll zoom in, hopefully this will load in a little bit better. The work is on two separate fronts. And so you see on the top here, we have the kind of, on a sort of megastructure master plan scale. And then below is a kind of room or body scale. And so to offer a bit of background to each of those processes, so far we'll start with that smaller sort of animated room fragment scale. And so this actually begins with these photographic sets, which I've been collecting. And I'm actually not taking these photos. I'm writing a set of instructions, which kind of call for 60 images to be taken that fall into like a rubric of some sort of postural categories. And the models are sort of free to improvise within a kind of structure. And so these photos are sort of taken remotely relative to me. Some, on the other side of the country, on the other side of the world, and so forth, and are continuing to be collected even now. And so then I kind of pull these together into a collection of sort of interesting postures and start to pick out kind of chance encounters and missed connections between the images and see where there might be affinities to sort of discover. And that kind of ultimately leads to sort of this main part of this first phase, which are these collages, which kind of have a particular treatment to the clothing and to the backgrounds that kind of turns everything into a sort of graphic sort of aesthetic while leaving the bodies very photographic. And you can see even in some of these that the sort of edges of the original photographs actually play a role in determining the composition of the collage. And so in the next phase, a kind of another dimension gets added where these become spatialized, but instead of trying to sort of read the space, I just sort of read the lines of the image and produce a series of cuts and folds and sort of slight transformations that make these little models right here, just pictured in Rhino. And you can see that those then kind of these sort of 2.5 dimensional models can be sort of recomposed, which leads to all these new affinities and spatial conditions that play out across the overall assembly. And then of course, you actually have to like make them for real. And so these are them printed out and cut and folded and photographed again. And these are these sort of 2.5 dimensional study models, we're calling them. And so moving on now, actually jumping back really to some of the larger scale stuff. This is a really early sort of sketch idea of how I might start thinking about the section of the project. And it was really kind of based on the idea that I wanted the sort of project as designed to be sort of fundamentally linked in some way to the representational strategy, or perhaps almost prefigured by the representational strategy. So here I'm collaging, but it's more of a kind of overlay technique where I'm developing a sort of tonal and textural section that then perhaps leads to some kind of architectural conclusions afterwards. And then you can see how this sort of turned into a model, which is really more of a plan and an elevation brought together into a model. In a way, they still kind of are being looked at separately, at least where I am now. But the model sort of plays out some really basic ideas of self-similarity and sort of decentralized spaces, and looking at a sort of like decay of the grid towards the periphery, and also sort of thinking about an architecture as perhaps made entirely of speculation. And you can see here that, you know, it actually starts to almost look like a building, just a little bit, and then very quickly, as I sort of rework on those photographs, it kind of dissolves away into plenty of other sort of abstract conclusions. However, there's this, which is like a really sort of recent study based on those photographs on the red background above, where I'm kind of using the collage and overlay techniques and this sort of assembly strategy to build up larger facades and elevations, and then even kind of develop a sort of false perspectival space. And so this is kind of just the first step of perhaps another investigation. And so just to kind of wrap up and bring this around, I would just add that sort of in the context of the work here, the kind of unconditional spaces that I'm talking about are those which work against type not simply by subverting functional norms or remixing occupational forms, but most crucially by erasing the embedded conditions which make a given space contingent upon bodies that are either served by or in service of that space. Again, these are counterproductive spaces insofar as they oppose all kinds of economic utility. They are fallow, not barren. And that is it. I'll stop sharing my screen. Thanks. I could also actually maybe reshare my screen if we want to keep looking at it. I just realized.
Yeah, that might be helpful.
Yeah, we'll do that.
If you navigate maybe to an area that you think is representative.
Yeah. Kind of.
And we may have been joined by Eric Ganoyu, our history theory advisor. I thought I saw him. You may.
The bread image.
Actually, Wesley, can you go to this image that you had at the end where you're starting, it seems like you're starting to merge this folded paper 2.5D model. At the bottom, what's going on with the...
Yeah, so this I kind of left out of the presentation I gave, because this is kind of a really recent just sort of experiment. While I was photographing these, I was using the same material to back the images as I backed up for the images, which was kind of, I thought might be interesting, but I didn't know why. And then turning them backwards, I don't know if this is really the direction I'm going, but it did, you know, certainly produce like a pretty interesting effect or kind of arrangement of effects. And I imagine that I might be able to kind of utilize or exploit some of this along with this sort of a look as well, as I continue to make these.
Right, yeah, because I think these are really interesting. I know you said they're kind of new, but so, I mean, it could be something you came up with in the middle of the night, which is, you know, always something great in terms of like these spur of the moment ideas. I was just interested in this relationship between your collage photographs and then the pink model that you were showing. I couldn't really see. Maybe I didn't quite understand your explanation as you moved between those ideas. But formally, it's much easier for me to kind of understand the qualities that you're going with, the collage versus the model itself. And it's clear that there's this feedback process that you're using where you're going from image to model, back to image, and kind of working between the two, creating these textural conditions in the paper, which goes back to your collaged tonal effect kind of image that you were showing in the black and white. I can read that in the paper. Maybe it's accidental, but it's definitely there in terms of like this tactile quality. And I mean, I'd like to hear more from the other critics just to kind of put together these concepts that you were thinking about once you first started, you know, with the imagery, and then how that plays into the form, and what does this become eventually? Yeah.
I was sort of wondering about the photographs because you spoke about having all these images taken of these people in different poses, and then also selecting certain ones. I'm just curious, how important are those in informing where, is that what you're using to inform where things fold and tactilely, and it changes in tact?
Yeah, more and more I'm sort of trying to develop a way of working and a length. You can actually see that in some of these it's a little bit less refined of an idea, but as I went on, I sort of really tried to specify that all of the sort of geometry of the backgrounds and the way that the folds then play out when they become models are all in some way derived from elements in the original image, whether that's the sort of floor line or the actual boundary of this original square image, kind of holding its shape even in the collage, and that's a pretty important part of the collage process. So like not cutting these people out of their backgrounds or out of their context, and like the contexts are really equally as important to the collage, even though they get treated differently than the skin.
So then in the newest ones that I know that you didn't want to include it, but the ones that these two images below. So then does that mean, do you see that these poses and how you started with people, they start to become embedded into the actual thing, start to disappear as an image altogether? Is that where?
Yeah, I think I'm interested in building up this sort of set of collages so that I can start to assemble them into even larger architectural conditions, whether they're sectional or in plan. I kind of, a lot of them work on both levels. But I put these below are just the back sides of all of these, right? And so I backed them with that because I had the thought that perhaps in the process of photographing or turning them in relationship to each other, they needed a kind of finished back as well. They couldn't just be only viewable from one side. So I don't really know how that will work for me later, but that's sort of the idea there.
I too also have the same question as Majda, is then how does this relate back to, or if that's the specific question, but how does this then relate back to the pink image?
I really have two miniatures today for you. They're
okay.
very much like, yeah, they're separate. I've been working on them really separately, and at times I kind of bring them together, sometimes in an image and sometimes just in thinking about the process. For me, they're certainly held together by the sort of idea and the sort of socio-political aspirations of this project, they all kind of connect with this, but ultimately these are two separate ways of exploring kind of the same project, and I've yet to see exactly how they collide.
Yeah, I think I would like to see how they collide. I think that, and I think it's useful to note, like the idea of the miniature. The way I understand a miniature is that it's a storytelling device. It's not as much a scale representation of something. So to begin to think simultaneously about those gridded arrangements that you showed us, and these, there's still a grid here, and these grids simultaneously and without reference to scale of the human body. That would be, that to me seems like it might be an interesting way to start moving this forward, because I'm perplexed. Like, where's this going? You've got these photo collages that you're starting to spatialize and give dimension and fold, and then you've got these kind of gridded spaces, these grid organized spaces that, where do they start to talk to each? Well, they're talking to each other now, but where do we see them work together? Where do you talk about them in the same phrase?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, do you have a plan for that, or?
Yeah, I mean, I think as theoretically, the idea is that as the resolution of this becomes finer, and I start to, I mean, and this is really a draft of an idea of a plan. I mean, it's kind of, rudimentary in a lot of ways, and I don't really know what the scale is here or what the idea is. It's very much diagrammatic, but hopefully, as the idea of this as like a super large scale kind of object that is perhaps in a field of like many more objects that, and you can kind of see here, it's still kind of working from these really early drawings, which in a lot of ways don't have very much to do with the process I'm kind of onto now. That as the resolution becomes finer here, and the sort of buildup of these collages becomes vaster, and I might have a kind of array of 12 by 12 or 50 by 50 of these things, whether digitally or physically. That's kind of where they meet, and suddenly this is taking place somehow inside of here.
Yeah, that's what I'm getting at.
Yeah,
and I guess, like, going back to what I was asking about scale, you almost have like a kind of fractal kind of system there, where I could see any of those squares being just like any of the other squares when you zoom in on them. So given that, how do you think about scale in your grid studies? Like, do the people shrink when you go into those little tiny little window arch things there? Or is that a hand-sized pocket? Or are there miniature little people in there?
Yeah, I mean, like, so something like this, which is kind of like just a guess, just to kind of test, is like certainly not right, I would say. Like, really the people live in here, I think, maybe.
So there could be, but I mean, could there both be, is there an absolute scale for this? Or are there like smaller people and smaller and smaller and smaller people?
Well, the idea is that perhaps,
yeah.
I can, because of the self-similarity of the larger thing, I can show this and make the point that this is actually, we're just looking at a smaller part of, it continues to go, right? And so right now, certainly, like, these are really all about the scale of the person, and like the space is like always going to get defined by that.
Yeah.
And I would agree that definitely like the larger thing is really like super undetermined with respect to scale. So hopefully one will inform the other.
So you just,
Let me interject a little bit, since I've seen something of the trajectory of this project before it ever looked like this. I think that on a scale level, this project is really kind of you could say it's like a new Babylon or a Hilbersheim Berlin project. It's about the relationship between non-existence of the individual and an absolute focus on the individual, and a kind of discomfort in the relationship between the two. I think that it's that kind of like, doesn't know whether it's a utopia or a dystopia kind of project, but it's probably both. And so I think like that Wesley's like evasiveness about scale is because the operative level of the scale isn't in the architectural object yet. It's happening in a kind of on the conceptual level, and then the architectural object is kind of giving or concealing a glimpse of where that kind of active scale is. I mean, which is kind of like an update of those old utopian anxieties to conditions that are so dissimilar to the ones that they tried to tackle back in their own time, but that which we could say maybe we don't yet have the tools to understand how we can embody those in a kind of like urban scale architectural format that kind of has an understanding of how it's meant to kind of recode ordinary existence. Would you say that's fair, Wesley? Just to put words in your mouth.
Totally. Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Words I
Eric,
probably
I
could
think-
have said more clearly. Yeah, definitely.
I think that was really well put, Eric, because it's sort of as we look at the model where you begin to insert the photographs of the people and the spaces that were generated by them back into the big pink model, there's really an inherent tension between the formal eccentricities that are produced by the way the bodies are moving that really have nothing to do with type, and then the relentlessness of the grid that also really is not type, it's more of a generic condition and a pervasive condition. And so by inserting these kind of individual identities into that rigid structure, you're really producing a kind of tension, which it seems to me, yeah, is exactly where Eric's comment was going. And then, I mean, I guess the question still now is what is the next and kind of, I mean, since we now have, well, we have until September.
Mm-hmm.
So
I wonder whether Wesley, I'm sure you saw Exodus. I don't know. I see a lot of Exodus. I see Exodus as a dystopia, and yours is this kind of other world. I really like what Benjamin was saying about the miniature being a story. I think I'm missing a bit that connection of the story, the way that Exodus does.
Yeah.
No, yeah. So I agree with Eric, the way that, and Exodus did the same, the mega project, the kind of detachment, the human detachment of the mega project, therefore the invention of this narrative. I really like your text. I mean, when you were reading, I thought it was great. I think that I agree with the comments that the imagery doesn't necessarily match the text right now. I mean, I think that you have few more, 2 months, like 2 months to do that. And so you just have to keep going. I think that they use a collage, not like your collages, but similar collage. They stole or took or borrowed from Super Studio and Andrea Bansi with Archizoom, and like look at how they, but to Marcelin's point about the grid, I wonder what the arch is doing here. As a typo, I see the grid, I don't see that the form of the arch. Mm-hmm. In the narrative, I don't mean formally, it's just sure. I don't see it fit.
Sure.
And if you look at Exodus, it's the wall, but there were different worlds. So you definitely, that diagram you did of repeating the grid, I thought that's the way to go.
Yeah.
Yeah, like I thought that's amazing.
Yeah.
Both of them.
Yeah.
Because I think that you have to keep on recreating the worlds. The photograph from the photographer are amazing, because that red background, if you had white, you would have had a figure ground. Now you have like, there's a world and there's another world inside, like there's like content already in the red zone. So I don't know, I mean, I don't have an answer for you, but I just think that You have your script done. You have to match the imagery to the script. This is, I mean, and I think Exodus is an excellent example of the two, the script and the representation and text coming together.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think in the representation, I agree with Valencia that it's a story you're after here. To think about you mentioned at one point your gridded architecture as an architecture of circulation. I don't think you should think about that as like a building. I think you should think about that as some kind of structure on which you can hang these infinite variety of accounts of these human interactions, you know, and that they happen without respect to scale. Because that gets us thinking about this thing beyond being just a building.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And
I
so
think-
one more thing, just to make a note, sorry, Marceline. Eric just put Karl Marx Hof, the Red Vienna. I don't know, Wesley, if you've seen that example.
I haven't, but I'll have to.
You have to see it. That's it. Done. The project is set.
Okay.
This is the best case study that you can use in Red Vienna. So your red now is metaphoric right now.
Okay.
Yeah, they already built your project. I'm sorry.
Yeah, it's done. You can retire now. No thesis needed.
Thank you. Thanks, Wesley.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
We're going to move on to Rish.
Hi, can you hear me? Can you hear me? Okay, okay.
Yes.
So my presentation is a video which is sometimes tricky and challenging in this type of condition. So please let me know if you find any problem on my video and audio. Then I try to minimize a lag by optimizing resolution of video as much as I can. Then I'm sharing my screen, but just in case, I'm gonna share the high resolution version, just in case, or you are interested in the high quality version. Then let me share the screen. And then, by the way, the video is 3 minutes and 30 seconds. I'm gonna start.
Aging and degradation is the natural order of things, which is dealt with by prolonging treatment or concealment. This project is about acceptance of ruin and contingency of decay rather than preservation. Signifying ephemeral beauty in a graceful end. Its aesthetics are melancholy, a staging of contrasts between selflessness and bewitching life. Its aesthetics are flamboyant, yet modest, with inevitable irony. Its aesthetics are ambivalent, with comfortability and uncomfortability.
Okay, now I'm sharing the still image. That's all.
Thank you, Rich. That was great. And
Thank
sound
you.
worked, at least in my computer, worked really well. So you made it. You
Yeah,
figured
I try to optimize the resolution. Maybe resolution is really huge game. Like if you play the high resolution and then wait full screen, so it lag happened. But if you minimize the resolution, it's more smooth.
I think I could say just a little bit about this. That just I've been thinking about this since we just spoke recently, Rish, and
Yeah.
and there's one thing that's striking me as I think more about what you're doing is that there's a fundamental difference between the kind of ruination of inanimate objects and biological decay, right? And that we often think of the aging of the built environment through the kind of the in a kind of like geological sense, you know, like weathering and erosion, things kind of twisting and coming apart. Even when, you know, it might be like wood and shingles getting rotten, we don't think of it in the same way. So I think that there's a very different, by kind of completely embracing the aesthetics from that more kind of biological decay side, I think that it opens up very different doors from what a normal weathering project might try to do. Maybe it's what gives you that kind of what you call the flamboyant yet modest aesthetics is coming out of that. And I think that's something to kind of keep in mind, that you're taking something that is in fact not alive, right? Not biological matter, almost in you know the majority of its parts, namely like the built environment, and then kind of thinking it through only in relationship to that kind of decay and that kind of transformation. And I think that that's a kind of point that plays out through everything. So it's easy to forget that we could be looking at a very different set of images if you were framing the project slightly different.
Yeah, there's a sort of known, I couldn't help but thinking when I was looking at it that there's a kind of known, this is a kind of known decay. I mean, this is the kind of decay that I see happening in my garden. It seems to be very like there's a lot of like fungal attack of these things. It's eating away at it, and I couldn't help but thinking like, well, have you thought about maybe exploring other varieties of decay? I mean, how do you put how do you limit your set of choices here? Is this like, are you saying mean, where do your interests lie? Is it in this kind of biological replication or this kind of simulation of this biological decay? Because that's what I'm seeing in it, or is it more expansive? I mean, how do you choose how you're going to decay these objects?
Okay, so I experienced a lot of decay, ruination.
Yeah.
Beforehand, and then first I started with paper. Like shredding paper, it's kind of a ruination, right? And burning paper or clamping paper, that's also ruination. And then after that, I started to interested in flower more, because the difference between paper and flower. So paper is also from tree, nature, but paper is kind of denaturized thing, right? But versus flower, I use a dried flower for the experiment, because it's like it hasn't denaturized yet. It's like it's preserved but containing kind of feeling of life compared to the paper, and that's more interesting to explore for this project, because I'm trying to examine life and dying of building, right? And then next step was the food, which I showed this time. So it's kind of, I don't know the limit. I set up a limit, but I'm more interested in the more like the something containing life.
Something that is that comes from life and then dies and decays.
Yeah, and the fruit is really useful in this situation. Like fruit decay really fast, so that's why I could see fast the result.
Yeah. But then when you get into your miniature, you've just sort of applied, I guess that's what I was thinking of, funguses in those last images, 33 onward. It's like a fungus has sort of overrun this Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, you know, the miniature of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. You know that miniature?
No.
Okay. But it was a children's show in the 70s. But it looks like this very it almost looks it looks like you've can you zoom in on like 35? Can we look at that? Yeah. I mean, this is like the kind of miniature world of a train set, or a to me a model train, or the kind of displays you might see in a department store in the holiday season or something. But I just wonder, like, how do you choose now to decay is more than just hair growing on these things. So how do you apply, how do you make something decay, which is a building? It's not a piece of fruit. I mean, how do you make those, how do you make your choices now? Because you've got a variety of different materials there. You've probably got a miniature that suggests brick, and you've got a miniature that suggests wood, and something that suggests concrete. All of those in meat space would decay according to different, they would have different ways of decaying, and they would be susceptible to different types of decay. So how do you make a choice in this when you're decaying this miniature?
Okay, so I'm not sure in terms of the material, but the interesting decay for me is, like, for example, architectural decay, generally speaking, it's more subtraction rather than addition. Like, for example, the wood, it's kind of like losing the quantity right? But fruit, what I was interested in was it's more a ruination of like it's additional ruination or melting, the deformation. Like the
Melting.
mold is growing. It's like quantity. I'm not sure the biological situation, but visually the quantity is increasing because you see additional things, right?
Yeah.
So that's some totally kind of different from typical architectural ruination. I want to, pursue more and apply that sensibility to architecture, but I'm not sure what material or that kind of tectonic or I don't know. But it's like more. I mean,
Yeah, because it seems like right now you're in the early stages of decay. Like when I open up my compost bin, like when I put certain fruit in the compost bin, it invokes this furry moss that covers everything, and everything still has the same form. But then as time progresses, the objects and the fruits within the compost bin start to shrivel and shrink and dry out. And for me, I'm just wondering, like, trying to understand how you could think about this more forcefully, and really get deeper into it, rather than just applying this kind of furry moss or this furry fungus, which is, like I said, the first thing that I see in my compost bin. It's not the last thing that I see in my compost bin.
I think that's an interesting point in light of the idea that the furry fungus, if it's just a surface, if it doesn't structurally compromise the buildings, it's just a style.
Right, it's just a style. So I'm getting like, maybe he needs to use a word besides decay, like, I own a house, right? So I think about things like the way that my wood is on my deck is weathering, but that's a different kind of decay than, say, termites or moisture rot, where there's like something eating it from the inside. So like it appears like in your images at the end, you're just, it's like you said, Eric, surface decay. It's not like it's not penetrating inside of the material and compromising its structural capabilities.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point to pursue. Like, this time I just maybe more concentrate, I'm more playing with the material, but it's really, I should consider like how to think about interior space. Like, let's simply say, delve into more what's decay.
Yeah, what is decay?
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's different for different materials. And I think that's still not evident in your presentation.
But I think that's a great idea. Maybe you can send us, Benjamin, photos of your compost bin. But
you don't have one?
Stages, so let me know. But my kids in the school have, and it lives right next to the playground of the kids. Yeah. So I was shocked. I mean, like the kids playing next to the compost bins in the school.
Yeah.
And so I like this idea, Rich, that, I mean, if you look at the chat, I don't know if you missed on the chat, there's a whole other review happening in the chat room.
Okay, I will check that.
Copy later. But I think that I will. There's idea of ambivalence. Marceline is talking about ambivalent aesthetics. And then Eric is saying that you have decay and decadence. Like you have compost bin is decay, but you also have like, it's this multivalent, like he asked me, don't you have a compost bin? It's almost as a given, like it's almost as you live with that. And I really like the idea that it starts humidity, moss, and then dryness, like, I'm not an expert, but there's a stage where things change, quite a lot. I think those Rich are great points. And also I wanted to remind you, this is only the beginning of thesis. So Rich can continue doing, let the compost bin evolve. It's nice, the Mr. Rogers image that Jonathan put in the chat. because you can do a city, you know, like this is a kind of that image. It's a little bit, I mean, weird, I would say, him holding that model. It might be a good idea for your final, you know, that's, he only has one block, you know, it evolves. So it's not a surface problem of entropy. And also how you move from entropy and decay. I think Rich, you were saying decay, you have to pair it with something. This multivalence, I don't know, Marcin, is that the word?
Multivalent, yeah.
Multivalent, you need that. It's this, also Rich, I don't know if he mentioned, but he's been looking a lot, reading a lot, the work of Sianai about new aesthetic categories. It's not ugly and it's not beautiful. What he's creating is something, these feelings that are you cannot recognize really. So it's not, you know, it's not decaying, and there's beauty in decay, you know, like it's like, you know, this kind of mixed feelings.
Right. You know, there's also an opportunity perhaps to make a kind of comment on a kind of the kind of culture that you're representing in your miniature there. I mean, the fact that it's Mr. Rogers' neighborhood type miniature, at least that's what I see in it, that it's interesting to contemplate an image of that decaying, you know, decaying this kind of, it was a kind of, kind of universal kind of application of, you know, child psychology to you know, to the masses through television, and the neighborhood was meant to represent a very safe American place. Everything was in the right place. Everything was kind of perfect and happy and harmless. Now you're representing that as decaying and rotting. I mean, don't forget about what you're showing as your miniature, what the beginning starting material is, what you're going to rot, because that could provoke a lot of interesting conversation.
Mhm.
I think in the same way we could say, like, the kind of, with the idea of the compost pile, that this was a kind of like left-wing hippie concept of like recycling was as well, you know, and that these things maybe have mainstreamed, and so they kind of belong in this Mr. Rogers' neighborhood suburbia. Like, for sure, Mr. Rogers had a compost pile, and so that this kind of like the normalization of a kind of maybe hippie rationalized like life cycle vision might mean that it's not really fighting suburbia, but that it's come home.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, knock on wood.
I think we're almost at time. Is there any last comment? Well, maybe I'll make one. Rish, I think that it was really quite a remarkable film. I love the way you're working also with the soundtrack and the kind of the pacing of how the camera is approaching the architecture. And I do think that this multivalent quality is so powerful, like the things that look like frost, and then at another moment they might be fur, and you're not sure, is that something that engages you or kind of repels you? So, you know, I would say you're really, really onto something with those qualities, how you're developing them aesthetically.
Thank you.
So I think we need to move to Zeipeng. Hi, Zeipeng.
Yeah, I'm here. Hi, everyone. I start to share my screen. My thesis topic is about the archisanitary block, and I found the object in our daily library has a variety of properties, such as their own color, different flavor, and unique texture. I hope to highlight the property of the object themselves by covering other additional property of the objects. In this way, I can find a starting point.
It's cutting, your voice is cutting out. Maybe you can go closer to the mic, or if you had a mic, just talk to the mic, because it's cutting out.
Sorry, I didn't prepare the microphone. Okay. Can you hear me clearly right this time?
Yeah, that's better.
Okay. Hi everyone, I'm Zepeng, and my thesis topic is about the archisanitary block. The topic is actually the block. So I find the object in our daily life usually have a variety of properties, such as their own colors and different flavors and unique texture. Through this method, I hope to highlight the property of the object themselves by covering other additional properties of the object. In this way, I can start the starting point of the design from the property of the object themselves. And I found some precedent here. It is the silver factor of the Andy Warhol. He started his studio there by wrapping all the stuff inside in the aluminum. And I picked few sites to study, like some residential style area and commercial area, and modern style area, and some Elizabeth style area. And I finally, later, I isolate some different kinds of the elements from the different blocks. So this is some elements that I find from the block. And then, and later, here's some models. And later I build up my own block. I'm trying to abstract the style by wrapping them to show its own property like this. I wrap all the stuff there, like the trees, the track lands, the people inside. And through this, I can find some very interesting elements inside beyond the beyond the other properties. For example, I found the house, the corner of the house here, and then I make it flat and make it 2D. And then I can make the 2D into the 3D again. So the block there will be with maybe there will be some high-rise building there, maybe, who knows. And we can find more elements there and find more possibility of how the surface of the building will look like. And then the element itself, it can jump into the we can add the original object into the building that I built here, like the vertical city. And here's the miniature models. Okay, that's it.
Thank you, Sepang.
If you want to see specific slide, I can zoom in.
Can you show again that red slide number 25, please? Just that went very fast. The 25. Is the background, is there something, there's like another scene in the background? That's just really, it's kind of fascinating, like the environment. It almost looks like
no, I just use some different kind of the color there. So not just a pure red. It can reflect different colors, like the rainbow. So it will have different colors there.
So, Zepeng, can you explain your thesis title in relation to what you're doing with the wrapping around each of these objects?
Yeah, I'm trying to, my thesis topic is about the block. The block is not only referred to the traditional block of the tree or something. It also means that I can block the whole city or the whole block. I can plot the block. So through this way, I can show this own property, not just wiping out all the other things like you will ignore the colors or this or the height of the things or different the texture of it by using the same texture to wrap all the things there to reveal its own property. So through this, I can find the some specific good elements there. So through this, I can find something interesting and start from there to design some different kind of the block.
But what's the difference between wrapping every single piece in foil versus giving it all one, white canvas, plain texture to start with?
That's a good question. Let me think about that.
I'm just curious why the foil, and is there something about the foil that is important to you? It's giving me, not to be offensive to anyone, this idea of Passover and like covering each element in, in foil to avoid each piece, touching. I don't, maybe I'm not describing it in the best way, but like you said, it's giving this element of sameness or, but at the same time, it's not really the same because the smaller pieces get smaller wrinkles in the foil versus the larger pieces get larger folds in the foil. So are those discrepancies important to you still? Is it still the same even if the wrinkles and the folds change scale from object to object?
I think so, because different scales of the object will have the different kind of property. So if it is larger, so maybe the crack there will be more larger, and the texture there will be more complicated. So that will reflect to the picture that we will have later. Did I answer the question?
I'm still trying to understand your project in that sense. I mean, I like this image here where you're getting, I don't know how intentional it is, the reflections of different colors in the light. And I'm just seeing, how the light affects each surface. Depending on, how textured or how grainy the surface becomes from the wrinkles in the foil.
Actually, at first, this is a attempt for now. Actually, at first, I didn't mean to have the different colors there. I just want to make it black and white so that we can use that in the grasshopper to recognize this picture. So that will be kind of the strategy, I think. But I think if I just add a color into the picture, it will be more interesting.
Seems like when you say properties, there is something in your beginning text that you can now put number 3. Now you can, what was this last sentence? I can find the starting point of design from the properties of objects themselves. But it seems like you're sort of exploring only in terms of texture, and it seems so specific with foil, whereas like other materials, I do like the image of everything just sort of blanketed with this one material, and each object then becomes what was once autonomous from one another is now like seen as sort of similar in certain ways. I was seeing it in that way, but then you zooming in towards just texture itself, It seems, but you mentioned colors and there are different flavors. It seems like you're sort of missing those elements in terms of what you see as being properties of these objects that you're taking from a block and then blanketing it with one material. So I was just wondering, are you still in the same vein, also in that same question with in terms of color, and maybe that was a mistake with that red background, but is that something that you were also exploring rather than just flattening it to 2D pattern? And maybe exploring other types of material to blanket the block that you have, and within those blocks you have different elements that you sort of specifically chose. So I'm just wondering, what other properties are you looking to explore rather than the texture itself?
Actually, I'm still working on that since this is the strategy. It is a stage that I just achieved last weekend. So I'm still thinking about which kind of the property I will need to have in the to design and what kind of property that we can use. So for now, that is the texture itself.
I think that, I mean, one note, Jai and Maji, that I think what happened is that it got the, Sepen was working with wrapping. He started with bubble wrap. He worked with different, products, let's say. And I think this arrived later on, and we're still trying to discover what is coming out of this. But I think that to Machida's points of this avoidance or the single surface, I think that's kind of quite relevant in maybe, or the hold on one second. Oh, sorry. Kids are really noisy. I think that, he still has to discover. You'll see some points where he's circling and isolating. And to your point, Mashida, like when the rumple is tighter, the rumple is bigger. I think that those are not minor things. Those are things that he will develop.
Yeah, definitely. I think those are opportunities. That's why it's great to do like this miniature model, because, it's always nice when the model then informs the project and you kind of discover these little things, not little, as Francia said, they're important, the little crumples, the folds and the surfaces, and how does that eventually, feed back into your project, and does it affect your scan in any given way? I don't know if you're talking about a literal like 3D scan, and in that case, if you are actually scanning, how are you able to achieve the legibility of each crumple if your surface is really reflective? I don't know if that's actually what you're doing. Are you 3D scanning, or are you just kind of allowing it to influence, your formal process?
Yeah, I'm 3D scan that and flatten all the surfaces, so you will have the 2D image there.
Mm-hmm.
I would return to that, the red image. I mean, I'm fascinated by the fact that the modeling material itself is lit in such a way that it produces this kind of environmental quality. Because I actually really thought that was like the image of a tree, that greenish thing in the background. And I wonder if you could own that as a technique, so that the models that you make, just like this miniatures model, it's not so much about just like looking at the foil, but suddenly there are all these colors here that are not belonging to the material, but they're refracted light. So it's sort of like you're using the model as a tool to generate scenes. And I just think this one in particular is very fascinating. And there's something the sort of quality that you created here is very different than the ones that are in black and white, and where you have the kind of almost the Maya model and the contour cuts and things that are much more familiar, there's something here that is very, I think, powerful as a working method in terms of how you could begin to develop images from objects. Rather than often, like recently, there's been a lot of discussions about starting with images and deriving objects from images, like 3D scanning things. And in this case, you're building a physical model, using it as a kind of stage set and creating this sort of light box quality. And then we get these images. So I don't know, maybe they could become part of an animation or, you know, just like a series of kind of panning from scene to scene as you move through this block.
I don't know if anybody's question about 3D scanning too. I can imagine that some of the light refracting during the 3D scanning process would also create other, you know, geometry within that could potentially be really interesting.
Yeah.
Jonathan knows about 3D scanning a lot. Do you think that he can 3D scan and create some disturbance or something can break down, or it wouldn't even like take on that?
I mean, anything that's reflective, it won't scan. So you might get like holes and things, which will add to the articulation of those objects. And then the light itself, like reflecting off, might create its own kind of like texture on those things. So yeah.
So I think that,
worth a shot.
Yeah, I think that goes to Marcelin's point. I mean, he stumbled upon this. I think Sepeng found, and I think they're quite compelling. The photographer photos and the one that Sepeng, he took that photo that Marcelin likes. And then I think the feedback that is going from the image to the object rather than from the object to the 3D. I think that you have to see what's that process. And I agree that the design process that we see in wireframe there is something that we've seen progress already. So I think, Sepeng, you have to find your process, not only your final project.
Okay, I see. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. So I think now we will move to Amparito. Sepeng.
Thank you.
Hi.
Thank you, that was great.
So I'm going to share my screen here. So, hi, my name is Amparito. I put in 2 links in the chat of a video that I will be showing later on. It'd be great if everybody can just copy it. The sound is very important for this video, and I will be playing it on my computer, but just for everybody's sake. So a few of the questions that I've been asking myself throughout this whole project is, what is architectural program? What is sound doing in service of architecture? And can soundscaping be used to catalog a program? So sound could be applied in various things, but we are specifically looking at the attitudes and behaviors of sound and experiential genres of sounds. I like to call them manners. There are 3 types of manners. There's soft, there's ill, and there's strong. And the way I'm defining soft are gentle ambient sounds that are not given to an extreme emotion. And then for ill-mannered, sounds are considered undesirable to the ear, disruptive, interrupt, and disrupt the built environment. And then for strong, I'm looking at specifically at elements that are completely distorting the sound, such as white noise to the built environment. So what does this mean? Now to go over briefly how these sound manners are experienced every day and how they are impacting the built environment, I will show a series of videos of the sound manners, starting with the original built environment sound and following a substitution of sound manner examples. What this really aims to do is to explore the definition of program in a soundscaping perspective, where sound puts us in touch with objects, space, and the built environment. where we understand the sound manner as a way to relook at the built environment. So I will play the video. And if you have the links, now is the time to open them and play them. This is the original sound. Downtown LA. Soft manner. And strong manner. And then this is sort of an overlap with the miniature model of what I'm thinking of where my project is going to go in a direction. And so now we're looking at downtown LA's rich history of tunnels. If we look at the area around Grand Park, we come across a few existing tunnels, a few that have been demolished. We have 3rd Street, 2nd Street tunnels that are existing, and there once was a Hill Street tunnel, but has been demolished. And we have Grand Park as of we know today. But parts of Grand Park are still being developed, specifically at Spring and First. Along with the rich history of tunnels, downtown LA also has a history of underground service tunnels that once were used during the Prohibition age. So despite the Prohibition laws, 11 miles of service tunnels become passageway to the underground world of what used to be the speakeasy world. One tunnel in particular connects to and from Hall of Records, which is on Hill and Temple, and King, and then it connects to King Eddie Saloon on 5th and Main. This is about 1 mile span of underground service tunnels. So we could take sound manners as a way to design the built environment to an underground world of public spaces. In this miniature model, we explore the design of an underground public space that only services the underground world, but funnels the sounds above the built environment. It is also an exploration of different textiles, fabrics, and materials, and to get a sense of understanding of the acoustics of the space as well. So this is above world. The tunnel world. The public space. Thank you.
Thank you, Amparito. That was great. I think that maybe everybody can take a minute to look at those clips if you haven't seen it, because I think, I mean, we couldn't hear on the live, so I would take that up.
Yeah.
Yeah, Amparito, I watched or I listened to the clips. The sounds are really effective, and now I'm interested what the relationship for you between the sounds and then the materials that you'll be using in each of these spaces. Are they, as you're representing them, with fabrics? And does that mean that the sound will really affect the fabrics each time, you know, that the sounds are being played, causing vibrations and ripples and, you know, movement in the softness of the fabric? And are each of the materials representational of the noise? Do they each take on a different aesthetic dependent on the strength of the noise?
Yeah, I think for the materials that are being applied in these spaces could definitely take on the way the sound is being impact on this type of material. I mean, looking at it acoustically, it would make sense that it would bounce off a certain way or might move the fabric or the space a certain way. But that's definitely an exploration that I looked at, specifically looking at colors as well as maybe looking at how light or bright they are. Sort of because colors also have an expression of softness and loudness, and that was sort of one way of thinking of how they would be applied to the space.
Did you do a test where you're playing these sounds at really loud decibel levels that it's actually moving the fabric? Maybe that would be nice to kind of take a video of, you know, the reaction of the sound, the vibrations, and what have, because, you know, sound is like obviously a sense that you hear, but it's also something that you feel. Mm-hmm. And it makes sense that these materials become very tactile in the sense that it's reflecting, that the form becomes representational of, you know, the noise or the sound.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's definitely something I need to explore. I might have done that earlier in my thesis prep time, but something that I haven't done quite yet with this model.
Mm-hmm. I have a question.
Yeah.
So maybe I missed this. Can we go back to your statements earlier?
Yeah.
Just trying to understand. Are you trying to? Yeah, I understand this. That so here you've kind of defined 3 different categories of sound and how you feel like they either complement or disrupt one's experience of architecture. Is that what it is? Experience?
Yes.
Okay.
I think also in relation to how program and perception of space is being interpreted. So if you have the sound of the built environment of the city, for example, and then you change that to a more soft sound, the perception of that space is now different. Sure. And so I'm questioning what program is now in that space and how it could be used to define this underground world.
Are you proposing that the architecture attempts to, well, let me ask you this. Is the architecture a receptacle for sound, or is architecture a sculptor of sound?
I think it could be either or, but it could be a sculptor in this instance.
Okay. Okay. So you're thinking of the architecture as being present within this greater soundscape of the city, and then it's going to shape the sound. It's going to further your architecture itself is going to shape that sound.
Yes.
Have you looked at, say, done some case study analysis of architecture which is designed to modulate sound?
Modulate sound in the sense that how it's being distributed throughout the space?
Yeah, among other things. Yeah.
No, I think I was mostly interested in how one maybe just experiences it in an internal level, but that's something that I could definitely look into.
Yeah, I think that it's going to be hard to discuss. It seems, whenever I hear architecture and sound, I inevitably kind of want to know that somebody has looked into some of the science behind it, because it's not like the kind of way that a particular wall surface will impact sound is not something open for debate. It's something that's measurable, and there's, you know, reams of empirical data to support what a material or a kind of surface would do to a kind of sound. So it, you know, for example, like so I say this because, like, you could make a space which is highly reverberant and live, and there's the sound stays you know, you make a loud sound in it and the sound stays present.
Okay.
It reverberates off the walls. It creates a standing wave between parallel surfaces in the space, maybe hard surfaces, and you get a very discrete echo. Alternatively, you could create an anechoic chamber, which is a space which, combined with isolation of sound, blocking out the external environmental sound, it will deaden any sound originating within the space. So, you know, a classic example of what it means to experience an anechoic chamber is if you go into one, and there is one at UCLA, you might be worth checking out. But if you were to go into an anechoic chamber, you would be able to hear, the loudest thing in the room would be your heartbeat, and the sound of blood pulsing through the capillaries in your eardrums.
Right, right.
And you would experience it in a very, you know, sound in a very different way. And so both of those, which are kind of two extreme examples of how architectural material and geometry can modulate sound, I feel like it seems like those are things you might want to take into account when you're doing this project, because the materials that you're choosing and the shapes that you're choosing, those all, to a trained eye or a trained somebody who kind of knows architectural acoustics, it's going to yield a particular outcomes.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I guess what I'm asking is, do you want this to become an exploration of architectural acoustics?
It's definitely one part of it, but I think for me, it's mainly about exploring the perception of the space that's being formulated. And it could be that the acoustics are amplifying a type of environment in those spaces, but it's really about how program is shifting through those spaces.
Okay. So sound is only part of the story. Okay. Well, I mean, I think you have some good material, you know, to start with. I mean, I think it's worth noting too that you're in a tunnel. One of the things, you know, a tunnel in terms of sound is going to produce very particular sound phenomenon within it. And it's going to, you know, potentially isolate the sound of the city and maybe only make legible to your ear the low sounds of the city, you know, if it's completely isolated, if you close it off. I mean, all of those things, I think, to start to tell a story about how your project interacts with architectural acoustics, it is an expression of architectural acoustics, would help.
Okay.
Conceptually.
Yeah.
Yes, I think Amparito, that I think that you can't avoid. I think for this test, maybe really like the three-part, the manner sounds. I do believe that maybe if you look into, you know, the empirical research like Ben is talking about, you will find all the answers to those three modes.
Yeah.
Because I think the video, it's very poetic in terms of the misplaced. But then if you think of actual sound engineering, even if you hack that, meaning that you want so much absorption that you don't hear your step, or you want so much detail so that you hear everything, so you control it. And almost as if you even have to talk with an engineer, acoustic engineer, to really know what are those materials. And since the tunnel is a good stage, you can control everything.
That's right. Yeah. It might be good to just spend a day thinking about, or spend a day perceiving sound exclusively, independent of your visual, independent of your eyes. So if you were to wear a blindfold and you were to choose a series, several spaces that were of interest to you. Maybe one is, your living room. Maybe one is like a public, some, kind of like a public open space, an interior kind of gathering space, some kind of auditorium, and another is a, like a tight closet or something. And you were to simply make note of the oral audio environment that characterizes those spaces or those rooms. That might help. Also, if you looked at what is it about those spaces which yields, as Florencia was saying, with a little understanding of the engineering side of it, you could get a clearer understanding of what it is within those spaces materially in terms of their geometry that's giving them those audio qualities.
Yeah, okay.
Also, I really like, Amparito, the zoom in photos. Those are new, no? I didn't see them before.
Yeah, they are.
Point of like so much vibration that in one room, the fabrics are always like moving and so on. So I think that you have the engineer and the design, which is like hacking the engineer. So I think you have to find the right, you're not going to learn sound acoustics in like 2 months. So, that's another, like you might get the basics of that, like learning a language, like people that say, but find some clues, I think.
Yeah.
And I think so important is the idea of when we look at the miniatures model and we see all the different fabric and felt and the foam that's normally used in an anechoic chamber. But if you begin to kind of couple that with some unanticipated sounds, I think that's really powerful.
Okay.
So I think it's important, both there is this kind of engineering aspect, but I think it's really a design project. Like when I look here at what you've done with miniatures and even your selection of color and placement of the forms that are 3D printed versus the things that are textile, I can imagine that as you move forward, it's kind of coupling. It's like saying instead of starting with a material approach, we start with this kind of acoustic or audio thinking, and that leads us to the selection of particular materials and their deployment in a space.
Yeah. All those materials are going to have particular effects on the audio landscape.
Yeah.
And maybe think about how this space might be perceived by a blind person.
Yeah, that's something that's been brought up. Yeah, for sure.
So thank you, Alfredo. Unless there's any last comment?
There's always the chat for more comments, so please add them on. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Now we'll move to Jonathan. Hi.
Hi, everyone. I'm going to share my screen. I'm using two screens, so if I'm looking over here, it's just to make sure I'm linking up correctly. Okay. So my thesis deals with the mask as a thing of digital manipulation, and it kind of has these connotations associated with Photoshop. So masking has really become this standard practice for architects to kind of create these cohesive representations of their space and how it's represented. So really I won't bore you with the whole history of Photoshop, but this really wasn't introduced until 2008, this process. So it's like a relatively contemporary thing to deal with, and how it kind of relates to images and the concealment and revealment of them. So it's these black and white values that attempt to recontextualize and create new identities to alter these physical beings or images of these things. So a person that does this in like kind of the art world is Laura Owens. She kind of uses the mask as a way to kind of create these weird disconnects between contexts of painting or newspapers or things like that. So the mask not only really kind of dominates the way we compose images, but strives to transfigure multiple existences onto a single surface or object. So this is kind of where I think the architecture lies. So there's really this kind of disconnect between the form of the thing and the mask or the thing that is, creating it. So it really is kind of like this process of becoming, and this is kind of like a diagram of that. And this is merely on the surface level, not on the volume level at the moment. And my miniatures model is kind of, to be honest, my miniatures model came a little bit before some of this stuff. So it was kind of more like a representational thing of like feathering and trying to understand how I could use masking or these kind of black and white values to create some new kind of architectural object. So you can see, it kind of took the form of spray paint due to the limitations of what I could do at home. But yes, so my thesis rejects the homogeneity of the mask and rather misuses it by using a vocabulary of intentional gaps and slippages, generating material, form, and finish and minute articulation all at the same time. So I started to do some experiments of how masking can start to reveal or conceal parts of the architecture and rather develop it from scratch or from these series of images that I've been working at initially. So you can see like here how it starts to create these interesting overlays. And this is just kind of a video of my process. And then here is a more detailed version of that. You can start to see it starts to make these interesting drawings and overlaps. So I'm kind of suggesting here that the architectural form lies in the mask and not in how people see it necessarily. So an example of like this slippage that kind of happens is this building in Berlin. There's kind of this ulterior logic that kind of pokes through the building in this kind of strange way, where there's almost like this remnant of some other logic or building that exists within the object. So that's kind of the effect I'm going for. So these operations allow varying site-specific aesthetics to intermingle with injected ones and suggest new typologies of mixed use, latent in layers of the mass architectural object. So these are my initial experiments. It's not totally there yet, but I was just trying to experiment with how I can use aesthetics and masking to try to create this disconnect between these series of architectural languages. So here's just me kind of critiquing it myself and how even masking starts to manifest the way that we work as architects. And yeah, so that's pretty much it. And if you guys would like to see anything specific, just let me know what slide and I can move to it. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan. That was great. I like the autocritique at the end.
Yeah.
Can you just explain again in slide number 11, what's actually happening with the image and is the image becoming the mask, or how is that?
So this is a way for me to try to understand how, like, so in Photoshop, basically, or any other kind of, even in video programs, you kind of have this black and white and gray set of values on the right, and then you have some kind of image on the left, and really everything that's black and white drives what you see on the left. So this is an attempt, so this is just me actually building that thing I did at the end, a video of it, and then me kind of extracting the mask from that and trying to understand how those black and white values can start to create geometries, or I guess form. So it's kind of my argument that really the form lies in the thing on the right and not the thing on the left. So the perception is kind of what you see is not always what you get. That there's kind of like these latent layers that exist within the architectural form that you're not actually seeing.
There's something about the way you're describing it that makes me think about like a puppetry or a marionette, where the alpha channel is kind of controlling that ultimate outcome, but we don't really ever see the alpha channel as such.
Right.
Hi, Jonathan. First of all, great presentation. There's so much to unpack just in what you're showing us. But I'm interested in, you know, your prospect of the thesis. Either is it about developing a technique in which you're using a mask to create volume, or is it a study of the mask in this analog versus digital to kind of attack a surface? So maybe you can explain, you know, what you're trying to do.
Yeah, I think there's a layer that I'm kind of missing right now. That it was honestly kind of a question I wanted to ask you guys, is that I've been working through image mostly, and form kind of becomes this thing that's, at least in the way that I've been working, that's not really there per se. It's only a matter of the parts that I reveal through the masking that you're able to perceive that thing. So I think that there needs to be some kind of disconnect between the two, to where you're able to kind of understand that process. And I think that that last thing that I did was trying to do that, but didn't necessarily do it successfully, because you're perceiving that as one object rather than it kind of existing in the mask. So that's kind of something that I'm working through still. And I think that there's potential for that to exist volumetrically. And I'm not sure whether I want to take this into terms of like designing a building, or if it's something else. I kind of like, I have this question of medium right now, is like, because I can make it look as architectural as I want, but is that the right way? I'm not really sure. So that's kind of like open to conversation.
Yeah, I like the comment that Florencia wrote in the chat, you know, the slippage between image and form. And yeah. I mean, you're attempting to kind of either marry the two or find relationships between the two with your alpha channel, and then, you know, kind of this bump projection mapping type of method of extruding form from the alpha channel. And I think with the masking, another word that comes to mind is layering as well, as you can layer the masks over and over to the extent that it becomes so deep or so thick that it becomes volumetric. And in that sense, at what point is a mask just a surface or a superficial thing versus layered to the extent of becoming this thick mass?
Right.
I think I'd add that that for me, something that's interesting in what you've been working on, Jonathan, I would regret if you start turning toward physical materiality as if like it's not okay if it's not about that. like form is fundamentally never material. Like the nature of the concept of form in architecture, not physical, right? It's a concept that can be embedded in the physical, but that is always not really there. And I think that so the duality here is the form is there. Like you have form, but you have image, but you don't have you don't, it's not that you don't have physical materiality, it's that your project so far doesn't care whether there's physical materiality or not. As I kind of pressed you last talk when I said, is this potentially also AR or VR? And you're like, I don't know, it could be, maybe. Like, because it really doesn't matter. The conception architectural act that you're working on is one which is kind of radically indifferent to whether there is a physical reality to the building at all. And I think this is getting at something that we have to deal with right now in the field. Like much of what we do, much of what you do when you guys graduate is, you know, there will always be some people in every year who are going to go work making imaginary buildings that are like, we all make imaginary buildings. That's what architecture does. But I think that making ones that were never intended to be made physically real, you know, working in the film industry, working for the gaming industry, doing the other branches of architecture, I think that asking for a fundamental kind of critical lens through which you can understand architectural actions that is indifferent to physical materiality is kind of a necessary step. And like we probably need lots of them, but I think that it's good to have one derived from a digital technique within specific software that allows you just to nevertheless come up with an analysis that has implications for all the rest of architecture that might have been other than the ones that we expected.
Right. Yeah, and I mean, I guess that goes back to my whole argument, like the whole linkage between the two. Like it's, I mean, people always assume that the mask is linked to the thing next to it, but I mean, you can always kind of, like the things that Florencia was saying, it's like that slippage, is that it doesn't necessarily, there's these moments where it kind of slips out of place, and that's how you know that it's digital. And maybe it's not necessarily about what that thing is, but it's a matter of how those things slip past one another, and perceiving that is kind of the thing that I'm doing. And I don't think I've done that like completely yet, but I feel like it's getting there.
I wonder for Mashida's and Eric's point, if this idea, I really like the idea of thick mask, because right now it seems so superficial, no, that it looks like facade, but I know you don't want to go there, Jonathan, but I want, you know, the question is, and also this is not real materiality, but what if it's so thick, it becomes its own materiality, which is not real, but it becomes material, almost as if you go through it, like one layer, another layer, another layer. I don't know, maybe Mashida, you can expand on what is the layer, how you envision a layered mask. Because I think that's a layer mask is material. A single mask is image, I guess. So you move two materials through thickness.
Yeah, I think the layered mask, like you said, it's material, but at the same time, I'm not thinking maybe in the sense of architectural materiality or like a physical material, but more in the sense of a thickened, maybe a thickened surface. I'm hesitant to use the word surface because that's not what I'm trying to say, but you know, shallow mass, maybe like a something with thickness, but it starts to layer itself. Like I watched your vertical studio presentation, Florencia, and you have this idea of the paint becoming like a thickened mass and like this thickened.
Jonathan studio, by the way, so you probably saw his project and Amparito's project here. So.
Yeah, right. That was probably my project. Yeah, one of our projects.
Yeah, so I think there's a lot to take on from that studio into this idea of the layering and creating like this, you know, immaterial, thickened, gloopy substance that can come from a mask or the layering of what you're producing with these masks.
You have new titles: plump mask, meat mask.
Yeah, I think another thing that I was kind of interested in is like there's, like I don't, the video here where it's kind of like painting on the cube, I don't think is like the best way to show it, but is kind of diagrammatic because I'm kind of making the argument like there's these layers that are kind of like latent behind the thing. So there always has to be one layer on top of another. They can't just exist freely. Something's always on top of something else. So you kind of have to, like when you build that up, you can kind of erase this top layer, but shows this layer down here. And I think that's where that thickness that you're talking about comes from. It's not necessarily like the material thickness, but rather kind of like I mean, it's the same thing with a wall, like a wall section, you know? But.
I think the cube is a good thing to start with because it's something that we all know, and we can then check. We can conceive of the results that we can conceive of the results in a way that, well, it's just very clear. If you use a cube to start, I think that's a good place to begin because we can gauge the outcomes against something that we know.
Right. Mm.
I think also the question of identity and what is being masked and why it's being masked is so important because the word mask often conjures the human face.
Yeah.
More in common usage, but it can be so many things, and the mask itself can become the individual or the identity or the subjectivity. The mask can actually become the character on its own. And it seems to me there's something here that when I've seen your project presented, that it starts to suggest that. And so I think the way in which it gets applied and to what it gets applied are really quite important in terms of your choices. So I would agree with the earlier comment about Florencia when she was saying it's not about using this purely as an elevational strategy, but that it actually kind of does work on the body, whether that's an architectural body or a human body or some kind of hybrid between those.
What do you think it would be programmatically, Marceline? Like CIA headquarters would be interesting, or you know, some corporate entity, or something. You know, think about uses of buildings and occupants of buildings that have notions of masking in their identity, right? The CIA is something that's constantly wearing different masks. Corporations are always masking themselves and then changing their mask according to the latest marketing data. You know, what's housed in this space, this building? What are you masking?
I think, Jonathan, that's a good question as you move to miniatures. You know,
Midterm.
Don't do Mar-a-Lago, please. No matter what Eric says. And Vincent, maybe you can expand on your comment on the Schule Mehretu's abstractions. I think that's a great reference to the work. You know, he's been looking at Laura Owens, but I think that Schule probably is quite spot on onto that. Vincent, you're muted. You're muted.
You're muted.
All right, I said a bunch of really great things just now. No, what I really like in their article is when they talk about mining as opposed to masking. When she's, you know, using the photos and then mining out the information that she's gathering from these cityscapes and whatnot. I think that's a really great way to think about the information that you're gathering and sort of what that information actually is that's creating the geometry, that thickness, whatever. And, you know, what parts you're using, what parts you're mounting out, what parts you're layering.
Create their own.
Are really important to make it a rich thickness, you know, of information. But yeah, it says a lot of good things that I think can really help this project in that article.
Great, thanks.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Jonathan.
Thanks.
We are now moving on to Joy.
Hi, everyone. I'm Joy. Let me share my screen. Okay, so I have a working title. It's called The Architecture of Confection. My thesis is an aesthetic investigation of architecture through convection, the act of mixing and layering material. My use of aesthetics is to give the implication of the program, which is an urban horizontal park filled with playful objects, as known as a playground. A few precedents I've been looking at are playgrounds designed by Aldo van Eyck in his idea of how a program gets lived with minimalistic aesthetic equipment to stimulate the creativity of children. In the act of play, rediscovering the city through an urban space as a place to foster dialogue and stimulate community life. I'm choosing a different way to define the space, led by formal aesthetic investigations to suggest playfulness and imagination. So this is a playground as it extends into the city. The park that I am designing is a parking lot in the center of downtown Los Angeles, on the site of Angels Knoll Park, adjacent to Grand Central Market. The program is a stacked typology, taking cue from surrounding parking lots, with each level drawing from a catalog I developed from experimentation with playing with different ingredients, making candy and small confections. So my catalog consists of a liquid pour, a shell, a fusion, a spill, a crush, a smudge, a cast, and a drape, which translates into landscape, topography, and pavilions and other playscape objects. By maximizing a single surface, I'm bringing back more layers of the city and drawing a close link between architecture and the culinary arts, both working in modes of taste, experience, materiality, and consumption. So this is a photograph of my miniature model. I made a layered cake, and it's composed of several moves from my catalog, and which all came from a recipe and somewhat misused in the world of baking. The fondant isn't correctly draped on the cake. The cake is actually fake. It's spackled, but it's made to look like a cake. Things are composed on top of this cake to suggest different areas of play. So the objects, they all represent ideas that I will use to deploy my project for a midterm to try and understand its spatial implications. Thank you.
Looks great. Delicious. Thank you, Joy.
So Joy, are you a pastry chef?
No, I'm an amateur
No,
person in the kitchen.
not in the nails
That's great.
side of the, there's a show, cook show that my kids watch, Nailed It, with like,
Oh yeah.
which is, I told her she's not there. She improved a lot.
Oh yeah, for sure. So it's interesting that you chose to, maybe this is unrelated to your thesis talk, but the way that you're presenting the miniature, you're saying that some of the objects are fake in terms of, spackling a cake for the frosting, the buttercream. And then, so I'm wondering, are the sugar crystals on top, are they made from sugar or is that resin?
So everything is actually edible except for the cake itself.
Okay.
So everything is sugar. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, because there's something really interesting about confectionery and, these type of forms that you can create out of sugar and butter and, and I think there's this relationship between what is fake and what's real, because if that were real, then it would rot, it would change, it would decay, right? But if it were fake, if you're using resin, then you're not attracting ants, this thing doesn't fall apart, it doesn't melt in the heat. So what type of material qualities are you looking for? Are you looking for something more temporal? Or are you looking something more permanent when you actually create this park or this space?
So I am looking for a quality that is a little bit more permanent. So kind of along the lines of what you're bringing up, like fakery and the real thing. And so what I was really interested in with my set of experimentations is this quality of something that's frozen in time, something that hardens, something that from the previous conversation, a material that is layered up that can produce mass, and that being the actual volume that you can carve out of. And so for it to actually be filled with program or just implied program, it would be something that is not temporal.
Have you given any, oh, go ahead.
No, it's okay.
Have you given any thought to how it might be occupied? I mean, this is a miniature, and I can project my own interpretation into how it might be occupied, but are you going to have this project, dwell in a kind of purely aesthetic realm, conceptual realm, or do you want us to think about how, I mean, going into like number 31, what happens underneath that big glob of melted sugar, purple, blue, and red melted sugar? Is it a slide? Is it a water? Is there water in it? Are people under it? Are people climbing it? All of those things, like, delight goes beyond the eye. There's delight we can take in, moving through something, climbing something, touching something. So I'm just wondering if you're thinking about how this stuff might actually be inhabited.
Yeah, so well, with this miniatures model, I wanted to show just like the effect of layering. Yeah. And I actually put some objects underneath the first layer of fondant just to kind of, give some space inside, even though you can't see it. But I'm thinking in terms of if I have to represent it in like a sectional drawing or something, that place would be occupied as well.
Mm-hmm. So, but I mean, is it, sure, I mean, I understand it could be occupied, but is there meaning to that space? Is it a space? Is it a hiding place? Is it a cave? Is it a tunnel? Is it a slide? Is it a swing set? What is it?
Yeah, so I'm not so far along as to program every space yet, but I do imagine, some objects that could resemble like a cave or something that would have a volume that you can occupy.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's interesting that you bring up this idea of the section and the layering, because that goes into form, obviously. And my next question would have been to ask you about your formal language and what, are you really looking to work with? Is it the fluidity of the sugar and kind of the melting process of mixing it with the dyes, or is it more of like a casting thing, like what you're doing with, I don't know, what are those things? What material, or what is that, buttercream that you're casting or kind of placing in?
Chocolate, white chocolate.
Okay.
Yeah.
So each of these materials have a different textural quality, and they also have a different hardness or thickness. And I'm interested in the relationship between all of these and how you're choosing to place them by each other.
Well, like I said, this was my miniatures model, and it was like a kind of a sample platter of a cake that would not have been made by a professional. And I think in terms of representation, I think I've realized that a lot of, I guess the strongest readings come from the photographs that I've taken. These were taken by the professional photographer, but I think the idea of like image culture or image something with, maybe not in the form of a drawing, but like a photo or like a video or something to represent some of the ideas that I was playing with in terms of like fluidity and softness or hardness.
I sent a link to an artist who I really like that does some pretty amazing things with sugar. I think she's worth looking at for reference. She has some really, really amazing volumetric works, and then the different textures that she pulls out are really interesting too. I think it would give a lot of inspiration for you.
I think that one note on this, on the last few questions, Joy, I think that we'll have to talk about what is the translation. I don't think that's a minor thing in architecture, like you got a great, great research and how you translate it. I think that's always, the case. You can even look at Frangetti, for example. You have paper, how you transform it into a surface. You crumple it and you fold and you scan it or you mimic it. I mean, how exactly this is going to be translated? I think you did the Photoshop as the first round, but I think this is worth like it's a discussion about what is the role of translation in architecture. I remember when I was a student of Alejandro Sarapolo in Colombia, he always made us research case studies of architecture because he was saying there's no need for translation. Like if you study a hotel and then you do whatever, you always are in architectural scale. So it was like a way of like avoiding the process of translation. Of medium specificity. But I think that for us, it's really you open up the medium much more and then you allow it to be more hybrid. So I do think that still you have to make those steps.
So she's sort of defined confection. You've limited your definition, your discussion of confection thus far to the processes that go into making confections. You smearing, frosting, whatever, folding or draping your liquid sugar, I don't know the words for this, over the frosting, you're casting. I mean, all of these things have really have equivalents in architecture. you know, we cast things, we pour things, we smear things, different material, using different materials. All of those terms are used typically in architecture, or in at least in the crafts that are used to realize architecture. So I'm wondering if there's more to confections than simply these processes. You know, the art of the confection is not in just understanding the process, you know, of pouring or of buttering or of spreading frosting. It's understanding how those processes are instrumentalized to create delight. And it's so, like, what is an architecture of delight using these operations that you've defined? Because right now it's sort of, you know, what is delight? That's really the question this is asking me. Because, like, to some people's mind, that would be like a kind of, you know, your cupcake in number one is sort of, you know, it's definitely not like the kind of cupcake you're going to buy in West Hollywood. It's far more, you know, you're not quite sure what it's referencing. It's maybe referencing abstract expressionism and not the history of confections. So I'm kind of wondering, like, how you could start thinking about what is delight. Is that's what this, to me, that's what a confection is supposed to yield.
I also love the title confection because it's something we don't normally associate with architecture. It kind of implies something that's been concocted or assembled in a way that would occur according to different logics than those that we would use when working with geometry and trying to control form. That this idea of how one produces the confection, when that gets applied to architecture, I think it leads to a really fascinating set of outcomes in terms of both the aesthetic qualities, but also how it plays with, you know, some of the issues Benjamin's bringing up, the idea of delight or something frivolous or light or something that doesn't really have a fixed program in a sense. It's not a useful thing, but it's something kind of, you know, frivolous. So I think that you could really own that as an architectural strategy.
Definitely.
And I think your studies are really compelling, really beautiful, the casts and the different studies. Oh, Eric said Vespertine, that's perfect. Or Liz and Kyle, two SCI-Arc alumni who do sugar printing also. I don't know if they still do that, but they had a company.
Yeah, I emailed them. I wanted them to see Joy's project, but I couldn't reach them. Eric, do you imagine Vespertine, the Eric Moss Vespertine or the Vespertine chef? The version, how created an architecture for that?
No, the chef, Jordan Kahn's Vespertine is what I'm thinking of. I can actually, if you don't mind, I'll show you what made me just think of that. Here we go.
Because it worked with me, and Marceline, she showed that. Yeah, okay, you know.
Yeah, this food has that kind of delight question that Benjamin was bringing up, like that. You know, the Eric's building too obviously fits very well into that, but there's that kind of like just an exuberance of the formal like way through which it got carried out that goes far beyond what it happens to be as a piece of food.
Oh yeah.
And sometimes you even eat the vessel that it's contained in.
Yeah.
That was the timer.
Thank you.
Any last comments for Joy? Okay, thank you. Thanks, Joy.
Thank you.
And now we will move to Sherry. I believe Sherry's our last project.
Yes, Sherry is the last project, and But she actually, it's not so late for you. No, Sherry, what time is it for you?
It's okay. It's 8 o'clock in the morning.
It's 8 a.m.
Yeah, yes.
Okay, thank you, Sherry. And Mashida, what time is it for you? I'm so late. I don't want to know. Like 4 a.m. or something. Yes. Oh, okay. Thank you, people. Thank you, everybody, for staying with us. So, Jerry, you're the last project.
Yeah, I would like to share the screen. Hi, everyone. I'm Sherry. My thesis topic is the botanic imprint, the revolveness of architecture, which is focusing on a synthesis between revolving botanic species and engraving and embossing to make a mark on the body of architecture. Here I treat plants as a philosophical being. The role of architect is to design the revolving process in order to achieve specific futuristic revolveness effects. To work more like a landscape architect, one could imagine the scenario that revolving is going to take place, and the architect ought now to design the botanic imprint on the part of architecture details. The botanic imprint as a phenomenal imaginary of a utopian world allows the rest of human-made infrastructure to be imprinted by nature. Here above are the concept collage I made during the thesis prep. By continuing doing the research on the concept of botanic imprint and revolveness of architecture, I was amazed by Giovanni Piranesi's drawing and how enchanted and details of the rooms and background atmosphere he created, and recorded the delicate elegancy of revolveness of architectural elements. When I did the research of the Manolo Nomada's artworks, I find his imaginary architecture drawing were capturing just some imaginary city blocks. When looking deeply to the street, he made the building enrichments was similar to some Japanese CBD district. However, the building seems imaginary and would not exist inside these kind of streets. And here is how he created a botanic imprint on imaginary architecture. The World Expo inside the Crystal Palace was a centralized collection showing the power of colonization. The Crystal Palace is similar like a terrarium that brings beautiful things together, and also the Winter Garden inside the small hermitage brought the same idea of preserving the natural beauty. Here I choose the Jarvis Center in New York as the site of the projects. And here's the model I prepared for the project. The reason why I choose the New York is that the city is most urbanized and willing to have a tendency of broad natural state inside of it. There are also some interior concept assemblations for the botanic imprint for Jarvis Center. I'm trying to embracing the natural imprint without owning it. Here, nature is beyond, and I'm trying to document it and treat it as a gateway place for the revolvedness happens in the city. And here I would like to create a state of architecture becoming cohabitable for plants. This is the miniature concept model for the project. Because I'm out of the country, so due to the limitation of making the physical model, I customized and enriched the succulents and choose the glass terrarium, which is 14-inch tall. And my friends in Los Angeles helped me assemble them together. The miniature model, I'd like to depict the idea of how plants cohabited and imprint inside the glass terrarium like architecture, the Jarvis Center. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Sherry. The photos look amazing.
Yeah, I agree.
The photographer hung, when I put it there, I was like, where? Oh, figure out. So that was nice. So just a note for everybody, we did the last week, students did the only thing we can do at SCI-Arc physically, we did a drop off. It's called curbside SCI-Arc. So students drop their models, and we did it in groups. Then we put them in KEK. Then the photographer came alone and took photos. Then the photographer left. The drone came, took the drone footage. Then the drone left, and then facilities came, took the model, and then they left. Nobody could be together. So this was a whole week of overlaps, and non-overlaps, I mean, of like stages. So that's why, and Sherry, you know, she ordered the model. So I think everybody tried to figure out.
Thank you.
So Sherry, did you design the container in which the succulents are encased in?
For the miniature model, I find it online because due to the limitation, because I'm right now in China. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
If I'm in Los Angeles, I might like a 3D print the container to more suitable to the site. Yeah.
Because I think, sorry, am I talking over someone?
No.
No, I think it's interesting that I'm questioning now, what is the project? Is the project the container in which, you know, the botanical elements are encased in, or is it that the forms of the botanic elements are kind of shaping the outer container? In your case, maybe it might be interesting to actually look at the forms that these succulents are giving you and consider, you know, what is the space around it and how much of that space you want to be fully, you know, enclosed or kind of stuck to the succulents versus, you know, the gaps that you would get kind of at the top of your teardrop. I think it's such an interesting form. I mean, the fact that it's also hanging is something else to consider.
Yeah. Yes, it's a nice inspiration. Like beyond, like I'm imagined.
So you're imagining it to be suspended, kind of midair, kind of like what you're showing in the miniature?
That's what I am not first aspect. I thought I might be a like container on the table, but maybe I choose this kind of container that give a chance of let it hang in the air and give a chance to like give another state of how this architecture or containers like stays it might be in the future. Yeah.
Mashida, maybe to your question, Sherry, I was saying if you can play the PowerPoint so we can see your image of the container in big.
Yeah.
I think it's an important question for Sherry in the sense that the container is already made. Like it was, she found it online, she bought it online, and it's a ready-made as a glass object. So the Shavit Center might be a ready-made. She still doubts whether she designs the container or she adapts to the Shavit Center and works through the Shavit Center. I think that is a really important question for right now as she moves towards midterm review.
Yeah.
Have you given thought to it being both, that you're designing the container and the botanical imprint?
Yeah.
At the same time. It's usually, you know, those two matters, the matter of the concern of the building and the concern of the landscape are, sometimes they're co-conceived, but I've not seen a lot of architecture which really goes to great lengths to give the kind of priority to these botanical elements. Like even that, you know, those are, the architecture is sort of preconceived and then these other elements are added later.
Yeah.
What happens if you think about them simultaneously?
Yes, yeah.
not sure what that would be.
I think maybe a good precedent, just to go off of Benjamin's point, a good precedent would be the gardens, I think it's called Gardens by the Bay in Singapore, by Wilkinson Eyre, I think the firm that did that. So, you know, there's the issue of, as you're showing, you know, the suspended element, like the botanics are suspended mid-air through these, you know, kind of bridges. It's actually a really interesting project. Maybe you would want to, you know, kind of look more deeply into. And in that case, you know, what is shaping what comes first? What kind of pushes its agenda more? Is it about the botanical elements kind of taking precedent and kind of transforming the environment that it grows in a more aggressive way?
Yeah, yeah. Thank you.
I like the imagery particularly. I think the imagery that you have going is really strong. It sort of harkens back to that Hanging Gardens of Babylon, like something that should actually is something it would be really great to see, and it's become sort of fantastical. And seeing those two worlds merge together because of your concrete forms. I'm not sure if that's something that you also thought about, like if it's specifically with the miniature, it's glass, but with some of the imagery, it's concrete, and having that very clear, delineated juxtaposition of this very hard and cold material or glass. I see that happening, and I'm just excited to see what this looks like at the end, with all the questions that were already posed, whether it's you design the encasing or the plant sort of helps shape the architecture itself. So
yeah, I agree. I think like concrete, like this kind of brutal like material, it's a very nice contrast of this kind of live botanical elements. I think it's a really nice combination, as I like found during the thesis prep. So I use a lot of concrete elements, like architectural infrastructure as the background to making this kind of clash. And maybe I will like think about like bringing the glass material and also the concrete material together, like for the final. Yeah.
You know, when Jai was talking, I remember her thesis project. I mean, maybe you can, you know, you can send us some images. I have some, but I mean, her project was amazing. And she took, maybe Jai, you can say it instead of me, but you took a ready-made. I mean, you took what is now Smorgasburg, where, you know, where now it's just,
the site.
And recreated a whole fiction in there, amazing stop motion animations. I mean, Patrick Schumacher, who hates everything, turned to me and said, wow. So I'm like, wow, yeah. But what she had is that, I just want to talk about the ready-made. You had the block, you had that building as a ready-made, and you work through it through a narrative. I wonder if Sherry needs to have a ready-made or needs to make her own detail. You know, I think that has been the debate so far.
Yeah. Yes. Might not like maintain the original like structure or like architectural elements inside the drivers, instead of I will like create my own infrastructure.
At this point, I think that would be really interesting to see that you create your own infrastructure, because how much you control, is it that you want to control the botanical imprint, or do you want it to control the form itself in order to give a stage to the botanical imprint, or it's sort of which perspective that you want to take it from. So at this point in time, I think it would be interesting to design the vessel for.
Yeah. Yes, I agree.
It seems like that's the critique in the project is what you will ultimately decide is the what is subordinate, or is there a subordinate? Is the plant subordinate to the building? Is the building subordinate to the plant?
Yeah.
How can you define or talk about the relationship between the two in a way that we haven't, we aren't accustomed to, you know? And maybe to get you to a place where you start to feel a resonance, and you start to feel like it's working for you. You might want to, yeah, as Jai said, you try the container, designing the container, then maybe take a landscape or a botanical scape and design a structure which is subordinate to that landscape and weaves into that landscape. If you were to say, in a world without architectural budgets, if you were to take a patch of jungle and we were to say to you, design for me a structure that does not touch any of the plants within this this junglescape. You have to take the plants as a given, as though the plants were solid or radioactive and you can't touch them. And now you begin to design within that the envelope or the very porous space that those plants create. Now you have a very different way of looking at it. But if you start from those two approaches just as an exercise and see which one starts to make sense to you, or see which one is interesting to you, maybe that's a way to work on this.
Yeah, that's inspiring. Yeah, I think it's a nice approach. Thank you.
Sherry, we have a plan now.
There was a Frank Gehry building. Oh, go ahead.
So Arctic plants, what is then? No.
Oh, I was going to say one thing. There was a Frank Gehry building that he did in this museum that he did down in Mississippi that was ultimately destroyed by Katrina while it was being constructed. But it was in a grove of live oaks, hundreds of years old. And so to design the building, they scanned the live oaks, and then the building was occupied the spaces between the live oaks. But they took the sort of the live oaks as the the defining characteristics of the site, the spaces between them, the branches, in between the branches, and then worked back from that. Might be an interesting way to think about it.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. I think, yeah, we just, yeah. Florence, do you want to?
Yeah, I'm getting the other groups started closing now. Yeah, thank you, everybody. Thank you to the students. I think you guys did amazing presentations. And to the guests, it's amazing to see. And remembering all the theses and finals and events. And so, thank you, Mashida, for staying so late. Jai, you're like in Frogtown, so I guess it's not so late.
You're back.
But thank you so much. And Vincent, and Benjamin, there you are. Thank you guys so much for your generosity to share your time right now. And, we'll hopefully see you for final. I mean, it'd be great that you see the projects evolve and become what you were talking about, or a version of what we're, talking about. So yeah, I think Marceline, yeah, this is our closing.
Something I think is really amazing is as we're talking, I'm remembering all the projects too. The only one that I wasn't teaching at SCI-Arc for was Benjamin's, but I remember all the thesis projects, and I was just thinking about what an impact it makes, because we can still remember, like I can remember the soundtrack from the film, from Jai, from your, it's really funny how a thesis will really resonate and stay with the audience. So I think this attests to that. So I would really look forward to seeing midterm.
Mashi that taking over all of the North Gallery to build her model. Like she took all the desks, or half of the desks, that amazing models. If you haven't seen those thesis projects, Vincent, I think it was Keck when you had walls. So, you know,
I remember the cabinets.
Collect some of those projects and make a PowerPoint with them. We might send a follow-up and ask you for your images if we don't have them. So thank you, everybody. At 6 o'clock, there's an event that's not coordinated by me, that's coordinated by Natasha. So I think it's a dance and I don't know what it is, but it's something. So you can, it's in the link. The first link in the link tree is the link to the event, the alumni event at 6 o'clock. So again, thank you, everybody. Thank you for joining.
Thanks.
Thank you.